Welcome to Objective Writing. Chapter 2 of the Miller, Lynn, and Gronlund text focuses on this particular skill, but I've decided to prepare a presentation on the topic versus having you read the chapter. As teachers, you've obviously been writing objectives for years, but I'd like to take time to show you the approach recommended in the text and one that we'll use for the Table of Specifications assignment that accompanies this module. I personally really like this approach and have used it extensively in curriculum and assessment work at a doctoral level. This particular approach is the one most commonly used in graduate programs. There really are three main purposes for objective writing. First, to provide direction for our instruction, which, by the way, is most helpful in giving our lessons focus. Second, to provide guidelines for our assessments. And third, to convey our instructional intent to others. And the others could be a principal, teaching colleagues, students, or parents. When we write objectives, we can write them in three different domains. The first of those domains is cognitive, which focuses on thought processes and intellectual ability. You see an example of this at the bottom of the screen. Teachers in the United States tend to write more objectives in this domain than any other. The second of those domains is psychomotor, which focuses on perceptual and motor skills. You see an example of this at the bottom of the screen. Teachers in certain disciplines tend to write a lot of objectives in this domain. For example, teachers of primary children, music teachers, art teachers, PE teachers, foreign language teachers, driver's ed, etc. The third domain is affective, which focuses on attitudes, interests, and feelings. You see an example of this at the bottom of the screen. In schools in the United States, and elsewhere for that matter, we don't tend to focus much on this domain. I'd like to suggest we give the domain more attention in our instruction because attitudes and feelings toward a discipline often shape how a student approaches it. For example, if a child has a negative feeling toward reading or math or science, they tend to avoid it. That avoidance behavior often causes problems later on because the child doesn't grow through repeated engagement with that discipline. For each of the domains, there are descriptions of the major categories. On this slide, you see the familiar descriptions of the cognitive domain, which is known as Bloom's taxonomy. These descriptions, and those of the psychomotor and affective domains, are found in the handout entitled Descriptions of Cognitive, Affective, and Psychomotor Domains, and on pages 527 to 532 of the course text. The complete descriptions are found on the left side of the handout. Please take a look at this now in your handout if you would, please. You'll be learning to write General Instructional Objectives, GIOs. These are always labeled with whole numbers, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, etc. Notice that a GIO is quite broad in nature. Each GIO starts with a verb ending in an S from the middle column of your handout. This particular GIO, Understands Reading Comprehension Strategies, begins with understands, so it comes from the comprehension category in the cognitive domain in the handout. When you write specific learning outcomes, SLOs, they're always attached to a certain GIO. For example, the SLO 1.1 connects to the GIO 1.0. Notice how this SLO further defines and adds specificity to the GIO. Each SLO starts with a verb ending in S from the far right column. The verb demonstrates happens to come from the application category in the cognitive domain on the handout. Please note that it's not essential for the GIO verb and the SLO verb to come from the same category. When writing GIOs and SLOs, it's important to keep three criteria in mind. First of all, state in terms of what we expect from the learner. You can see a good example and a poor example here. And obviously the problem with the poor example is that it's not what we're expecting from the learner. It's what the teacher's doing. Second criteria is to state in terms that are observable. Again, you can see a good example, you can see a poor example. The problem with the poor example is that these aren't things that are observable if something is instilled. Then the third criteria is measures only one intended outcome. You can see a good example and a poor example, and in the poor one we have two things that are happening. We have the know and the applies. Two separate verbs which are quite different. keeping these three criteria in mind, let's critique 5 different objectives. I'll read each of them, and I'd like you to think if they're well written or poorly written and why. Remember that our 3 criteria are: state in terms of what we expect from the learner, state in terms that are observable, and measures only one intended outcome. Let's start with the first one. Sees the value of an experiment. What do you think of this one? It is poorly written because it's hard to observe if someone sees the value of an experiment. The second one. Identifies the symbols on a weather map. What do you think of this one? It is well written because it is stated in terms of what we expect from the learner, it's in terms that are observable, and it measures only one intended outcome. Let's take a look at the third one now. Predicts the outcome of an experiment. What do you think of this one? Okay, it is well written, again, because it's in terms of what we expect from the learner, in observable terms, it measures only one intended outcome. Now the fourth one. Knows and understands scientific concepts. What do you think of this one? This one is poorly written because it's measuring 2 cognitive processes, knows and understands. And then our fifth one. Realizes the importance of neatness. What do you think of this one? It is poorly written because it's really hard to observe if someone realizes the importance of neatness. At this point, you just need to practice this skill. I'd like you to follow the task list on this slide, and remember to start each GIO and SLO with verbs from the appropriate category on your handout. Each verb needs to end in S, and also remember to measure only one thing in each GIO and SLO. If you feel unsure about your written GIOs and SLOs, please feel free to send them to me privately for a critique in my email, which is rasj@bethel.edu. Teachers often confuse activities with objectives. An objective is what you want your students to learn, and the activity is how the objective will be realized. Let's look at some examples. An activity. Work on problems 1 through 24, page 49. The objective is that the students show the process of dividing a 3-digit numeral by a 2-digit numeral. Again, notice that an objective is what you want students to learn, and an activity is how that learning will take place. At times, the distinction between an activity and an objective can be a bit hard to make. Now, just as a side note, the objective writing process really starts the backward design process that you looked in the curriculum design course.